When James walked into his favorite cafe that morning, he was looking forward to a quiet moment with his coffee before diving into his day. But what he didn't expect was a confrontation that would turn his morning upside down. A woman named Megan, filled with unfounded accusations and prejudice, insisted he'd taken her coffee, and things quickly escalated from hostile words to an act of shocking aggression. As James stood his ground, what happened next left everyone in the cafe stunned and turned this quiet moment into an unforgettable lesson in resilience and integrity. Before we dive into this gripping story that highlights the strength it takes to stand up against prejudice, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The cafe buzzed with the familiar symphony of morning rituals, the hum of espresso machines, the soft chatter of patrons catching up before work, and the tantalizing aroma of freshly ground coffee. James, our protagonist, stepped inside and took a slow breath, savoring the comforting scents and warmth that contrasted with the brisk air outside. This cafe was part of his weekday routine, a small haven amidst his demanding life, where he could grab a moment of calm before the rush of the day took over. As he made his way to the counter, he scanned the room, noting the mix of people scattered around. Some were lost in newspapers or laptops, others engrossed in conversation, their laughter bubbling up over the general hum. There was something calming about the familiar faces of the baristas, who always greeted him with a nod, and the patrons who, like him, were regulars. It was the kind of morning that didn't demand much, just a brief stop for a coffee to help ease into the day. Finally, he heard his name called, clear and unmistakable over the buzz of the cafe. He stepped forward with a polite nod to the barista, extending a hand to take his cup. It was precisely how he liked it, a ritual that grounded him in a small but meaningful way. But just as he was about to thank the barista in turn, he felt a sudden, insistent tap on his shoulder. Turning around, he was met with the sharp gaze of a woman, a well-dressed blonde with an air of impatience radiating off her. Her eyes narrowed as she looked him up and down, her expression a mixture of irritation and something else, something almost accusatory. "Excuse me," she began, her tone clipped and cold. "I believe you just took my coffee." Caught off guard, James blinked, glancing at the cup in his hand to check for his name, clearly printed on the label. He looked back at her, holding it up slightly. "Actually, this one is mine," he replied, keeping his voice polite yet firm. He knew a mix-up was possible, but he was certain this coffee was his. The label didn't lie. Her eyes narrowed further and her tone shifted from irritation to open hostility. "Don't play dumb," she snapped, her voice rising a notch, enough to draw the attention of those around them. "I've been waiting here and you just swoop in, take my order, and act like nothing's wrong. People like you think they can just get away with things." James's stomach tightened at her words, feeling the sting of her veiled accusation. "I didn't cut in line," he replied, his voice measured. He could feel the weight of other eyes on him now, people watching with mild curiosity. "I've been waiting here like everyone else, and the barista called my name." She scoffed dramatically, making no attempt to lower her voice, letting her words linger in the air for everyone to hear. "Maybe you don't understand how things work here, but where I come from, people respect the line. It's common decency," she sneered, her tone dripping with disdain. "You people always think you're entitled to things that aren't yours." James's patience wore thin. He glanced around, catching the eyes of a few other customers who were beginning to look uncomfortable, their expressions torn between concern and the universal desire to avoid confrontation. Despite the hostility directed at him, no one intervened. Aware of the tension mounting, he took a steadying breath, keeping his tone calm yet assertive. "I'm not sure what you think happened here," he said, looking her in the eye, "but I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. I understand if there's a mix-up, and we can sort it out with the barista, but this coffee is mine." She let out a derisive laugh, shaking her head as if he were a child who had failed to grasp a simple lesson. "Oh, please," she snapped, rolling her eyes. Her words hung heavy in the air, and James felt a familiar pang, a reminder of other times, other places where he'd been treated as if he didn't belong, as if his very presence was some kind of affront. In the midst of her accusations, he could feel the silence thickening, the soft murmur of voices now entirely replaced by the quiet tension that had taken over the cafe. Eyes darted between him and Megan, the anticipation palpable as everyone waited to see how this confrontation would end. But James knew he couldn't afford to lose his composure. If there was one thing he'd learned, it was that any display of anger could be twisted, his words used against him. So he stood firm, every inch of him radiating a quiet resilience. He refused to let her shake him, even as her words continued, each one sharper than the last. For a moment, the two of them stood locked in a silent battle, their stares clashing amidst the soft noise of the cafe. James sensed a line being drawn, and he was determined not to be the one to cross it. The silent standoff between James and Megan stretched on, thickening the air with an uncomfortable tension. Around them, the cafe's patrons fell into a hush, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned in closer, curious but wary. James could feel his pulse picking up speed as he looked into Megan's unyielding gaze, a combination of defiance and disdain hardening her features. It was as though an unspoken line had been crossed, a line that was evident to everyone watching, yet elusive enough for no one to dare intervene. Megan broke the silence first, her lips curling into a thin, mocking smile that sent a chill down his spine. "You know," she began, her voice loud enough to cut through the murmurs and the occasional clinking of cups around them, "I just don't understand why people like you think you can come into places like this, act however you want, and expect everyone else to just deal with it." Her tone was sharp, each word laced with an unmistakable edge, daring him to react. James blinked, caught off guard by the boldness of her statement. His mind raced, replaying her words as the implications settled like a weight on his shoulders. "People like you." The phrase echoed in his mind, as familiar as it was painful. It was a phrase he had heard before, in different places and contexts, each time reminding him of boundaries he hadn't chosen but had been forced to recognize. For a brief moment, he considered letting it slide, walking away with his coffee and ending the scene. But something about her tone, the superiority etched into her every word, made that option feel impossible. He couldn't just leave without standing up for himself, not when her accusation rang out so boldly in a room full of silent witnesses. Drawing in a deep breath, he steadied himself, choosing his words carefully. "I think you might be mistaken," he replied, keeping his tone as calm as possible. "I've been standing in line like everyone else, and the barista called my name. If there's been a mix-up, we can clear it up, but there's no need for this." Megan let out a derisive snort, shaking her head as if he'd missed some obvious point. "Don't patronize me," she snapped, her voice rising slightly enough to catch the attention of more customers. "I saw you push in and grab that coffee like you owned the place. People like you always think you're entitled to whatever you want." The room fell into an even deeper silence, her words hanging in the air like a thick fog. James felt a rush of heat prickling under his skin as he registered the full weight of her statement. Her eyes gleamed with a fierce self-righteousness, as though she had exposed some hidden truth about him that only she could see. He glanced around, noting the expressions of the people nearby, some with brows furrowed in confusion or disapproval, others casting quick, sympathetic glances his way. He felt the isolation of the moment acutely, the invisible barrier that seemed to separate him from the rest of the room. It was as though Megan's words had created a chasm, pushing him into a space where he was left to fend for himself. Taking a slow, steadying breath, James met her gaze directly, refusing to let her intimidate him. "Look," he said, his voice calm but unyielding, "I don't know what you think happened here, but I didn't take your coffee. I've been waiting here just like everyone else, and if there's been some misunderstanding, we can sort it out with the barista." Megan's face twisted into a smirk, her expression both amused and derisive. "Oh, isn't that convenient?" she sneered, crossing her arms as she took a step closer. "Act all polite. Pretend you're the victim. People like you think you can get away with anything if you just play nice, don't you?" James felt a knot tightening in his stomach. Her words weren't just hostile. They were calculated, designed to provoke and demean. He had seen this tactic before, in situations where people use politeness as a mask to conceal prejudice, a thin veil that barely hid their true intentions. The cafe around them felt like a stage, the customers like an audience watching a scene unfold, captivated but unwilling to step in. James felt the weight of their gazes on him, the collective discomfort of those who bore witness but chose to stay silent. The tension in the air was palpable, an almost electric charge that seemed to pulse with every word exchanged. "Maybe," Megan continued, her tone dripping with contempt, "you don't understand how things work around here. In places like this, people respect the line. They don't just swoop in and take whatever they want." Her words hung in the air, laced with an implicit accusation that cut deeper than any direct insult could. James's patience wore thin, the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior growing harder to contain. He looked around, catching the eyes of a few people who quickly looked away, unwilling to meet his gaze for more than a moment. It was as if they were watching a scene in a play, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. But no one moved to intervene. Determined to maintain his composure, he drew in another deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm not sure what you're trying to imply," he said, his tone measured but firm, "but I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. If you have a problem, we can talk to the barista, but there's no reason for this to turn into something it doesn't need to be." Megan's response was immediate, a mocking laugh that echoed in the quiet of the cafe. "Oh, please," she scoffed, her eyes narrowing as she looked him up and down. "I don't need a lesson in decency from you. You think you belong here just like everyone else? That you can just walk in and act like you own the place?" The word stung sharper than he'd anticipated. He felt a surge of anger rising within him, a powerful mix of frustration and hurt that he struggled to keep in check. He had come here for a simple cup of coffee, a moment of peace before the day began, and yet here he was, caught in a confrontation he hadn't asked for, forced to defend himself against accusations he didn't deserve. He glanced around once more, hoping for some sign of support, some acknowledgement that what was happening was wrong. But the cafe's patrons remained silent, their eyes flickering between him and Megan, watching but unmoved. It was a silence that felt both complicit and oppressive, a quiet acceptance that left him feeling more isolated than ever. In that moment, James realized that he couldn't count on anyone to step in. He was alone in this, and he would have to find his own way through it. Taking a final, steadying breath, he met Megan's gaze with a calm that belied the storm of emotions churning within him. "Maybe people like you should consider treating others with respect," he replied, his voice quiet but firm, each word a deliberate assertion of his dignity. It was not a shout, not a retort, but a statement, a declaration that he would not be pushed into silence. For a moment, Megan's expression faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a look of cold fury as she squared her shoulders, unwilling to concede. "Respect?" she echoed, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I don't need a lecture on respect from you." Her words were loud enough to carry across the cafe, drawing even more attention to their exchange. James felt the eyes of everyone in the room on him, the weight of their silence pressing down on him, a tangible reminder of the barriers he faced. He looked at her, his expression calm, his resolve unbroken. He would not let her see how deeply her words had cut, would not give her the satisfaction of knowing how much she had hurt him. Around them, the tension reached a fever pitch. Some customers looked horrified, while others averted their eyes, seemingly hoping the confrontation would end without further escalation. A few raised their phones subtly, as if sensing something significant was unfolding before them. Megan leaned in slightly, her voice lowering to a cold murmur, as if sharing a secret meant only for him. "Why don't you take your coffee and leave?" she suggested with an icy smile. "Places like this aren't for everyone, you know." The words struck him with a force he hadn't anticipated. Her tone, the smug look in her eyes, her posture, everything about her screamed condescension, a brazen disregard for his humanity. And yet, he reminded himself, he could not let this escalate. He had come here for coffee, a small, simple ritual, not a confrontation. But the way she looked at him, as if he were some outsider intruding on her space, was an accusation he couldn't ignore. The words came before he could stop them. "Maybe people like you should consider treating others with a little respect," he replied evenly, meeting her gaze with unyielding resolve. It wasn't a shout or a retort, merely a statement, a quiet assertion of his dignity. Megan's face twisted in anger, her features tightening as a flicker of rage crossed her eyes. "Respect?" she echoed, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I don't need a lecture on respect from you." She looked him up and down, her contempt clear. "You think you belong here, just like everyone else? Please?" Her words rang loud, echoing in the silence of the cafe. Around them, the tension reached a fever pitch. Some customers looked horrified, while others averted their eyes, seemingly hoping the confrontation would end without further escalation. A few raised their phones subtly, as if sensing something significant was unfolding before them. James felt a chill of anger and frustration rise within him, but he reminded himself again to stay calm. His heart raced, his mind flickering through options, wondering how to escape this situation without compromising his dignity or reacting in a way that might worsen things. He opened his mouth to respond but was cut off by Megan's final, sneering jab. "Just take your coffee," she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "And try to remember next time, you don't belong everywhere." The tension in the air was electric, a storm brewing beneath the calm facade of the cafe. James could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, each second stretching uncomfortably as he faced Megan's sneer. Her words, cutting, demeaning, and laced with hostility, hung in the air like smoke, lingering long after she had spoken them. Around them, the cafe patrons were silent, eyes wide with shock or discomfort, but no one moved to intervene. James couldn't help but feel the isolation, as if an invisible barrier had closed him off from the room. But he knew he couldn't let her get under his skin. Just as he steeled himself to respond, something unexpected happened. With a sharp, swift motion, Megan took her coffee cup, still steaming from the counter, and hurled it in his direction. The scalding liquid hit him squarely on the chest, soaking through his shirt and leaving a hot, stinging pain against his skin. The cafe gasped, a collective intake of breath, as the shock rippled through the room. For a moment, James was too stunned to react, the burning sensation on his chest momentarily numb under the weight of his disbelief. He looked down at the dark stains spreading across his shirt, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The cafe, once filled with gentle murmurs and the clinking of cups, had fallen into a deafening silence. Megan took a half step back, her face twisted in mock horror. She raised her voice, loud enough for everyone to hear, shifting her tone to one of exaggerated fear. He he was threatening me," she exclaimed, her voice wavering theatrically. "He was getting aggressive, and I just I didn't feel safe." The crowd, still reeling from the sudden outburst, glanced from Megan to James and back again. Whispers began to ripple through the room, fragments of conversations overlapping in the thick air. Some patrons looked skeptical, glancing at James with a mix of sympathy and doubt, while others seemed unsure, caught in the drama unfolding before them. James, his shirt clinging to his skin uncomfortably from the spilled coffee, felt a surge of anger rise within him. Megan's manipulation of the situation was as swift as it was insidious, her words twisting the reality of the moment to paint herself as the victim. She had acted without provocation, yet now stood before the crowd with wide, innocent eyes, casting herself as a vulnerable figure in need of protection. He took a deep, steadying breath, willing himself to remain calm. This was exactly what she wanted, for him to react, to lose his composure, and give her version of events some semblance of credibility. But he knew better. Years of facing moments like this had taught him the importance of restraint, of refusing to let others dictate his reactions. Before he could speak, a few patrons had already begun to pull out their phones, capturing the scene in shaky frames. He could hear snippets of murmured conversations around him. "Did you see what happened? She threw her coffee at him. I don't know. She's saying he was aggressive." Megan's face was a mask of righteous indignation now, her hands clutching her chest as if to steady herself. She let out a dramatic sigh, glancing toward the cafe staff with an imploring look. "Can someone call the manager, please?" she asked, her voice laced with a tremble that sounded almost convincing. I just, I feel really unsafe right now." The barista, a young woman who had watched the incident unfold from behind the counter, hesitated for a moment before nodding and disappearing into the back to fetch the manager. James felt a pang of relief. Perhaps the barista would speak up about what she'd seen, offer some truth to counter Megan's fabrications. But he knew that in situations like these, it was often the loudest voice that shaped the narrative, and Megan's was resounding through the cafe. While they waited, James stood still, his gaze never leaving Megan. She avoided his eyes, focusing instead on her own theatrics, casting occasional glances toward the growing crowd as if seeking validation. The murmurs around them grew louder, the spectators' expressions a mix of shock, confusion, and quiet judgment. The uncomfortable truth settled in his chest. Megan was manipulating the situation to its fullest, playing on people's assumptions and biases, bending reality to fit her narrative. Finally, the manager appeared, a tall man with a weary look about him, as if he dealt with more than his fair share of difficult customers. He glanced between James and Megan, his brows knitting together as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Megan was quick to step forward, her voice taking on a tone of indignation mixed with fear. "Thank goodness you're here," she said, clutching her coffee cup dramatically, as if it were a lifeline. "This man here was aggressive. He was shouting and wouldn't leave me alone. I didn't know what else to do." Her voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes wide with an exaggerated look of helplessness. James opened his mouth to speak, but Megan continued, not giving him a chance to explain. "I was just trying to get my coffee," and he pushed his way in, took it, and then started getting hostile when I asked him to give it back. The manager's gaze flickered toward James, his expression cautious as he processed the conflicting stories. James felt the frustration boiling within him, a simmering resentment at being cast as the antagonist in a situation he hadn't caused. Taking a slow, steadying breath, James finally spoke. "That's not what happened," he said, his voice calm but firm, resisting the urge to let his emotions spill over. "I waited in line, got my coffee when my name was called, and she started accusing me of taking her order. Then, out of nowhere, she threw her coffee at me and began claiming I was threatening her." The manager's eyes narrowed slightly, shifting between James and Megan as he tried to make sense of the situation. Around them, a few customers murmured in agreement with James's account, the whispers growing louder as people recalled what they had seen. "Actually," one woman near the counter spoke up, her phone in hand, "I recorded some of it. She threw the coffee at him." A murmur rippled through the crowd as a few others nodded, pulling out their own phones with similar footage. Megan's face paled slightly, her expression faltering as she realized that her version of events was crumbling in front of her. But Megan, ever resilient, attempted to salvage the narrative. He intimidated me," she insisted, a note of desperation entering her voice. "He was looking at me aggressively. I didn't feel safe. I had no choice but to defend myself." The manager glanced at the growing number of patrons holding up their phones, the flicker of screens casting a faint glow around the room. He took a breath, as if weighing the evidence presented to him, before finally nodding. "Thank you, everyone," he said, raising a hand to quiet the room. "I think we're going to need to involve the authorities to sort this out properly." Megan's face fell, her eyes widening as she realized that her plan had unraveled. She opened her mouth to protest but found herself at a loss for words, the weight of the collective evidence against her too overwhelming to counter. James remained silent, relief washing over him as he realized that the truth was coming to light. He stood still, letting the manager's decision settle over the room, his dignity intact despite the ordeal he had endured. The decision hung in the air, echoing across the cafe like a final bell signaling the end of a tumultuous standoff. James felt a surge of relief, tempered by lingering frustration as the manager turned to the cafe staff and motioned for someone to call the police. The witnesses with phones in hand murmured in agreement, their support a quiet acknowledgement of the injustice they'd seen unfold. Megan's face drained of color, her bravado faltering under the scrutiny of so many eyes and cameras trained on her. She clenched her jaw, a look of indignation flickering in her eyes as she searched the room, clearly hoping for some supporter to come forward and validate her twisted narrative. But the silence from the patrons was deafening, a clear sign that the crowd had seen through her act. In the midst of the tense silence, a barista returned from behind the counter, clutching a phone as she connected with the local police. Her words were brief, professional, describing the situation with an efficiency born of too many encounters with disruptive customers, though this one was undoubtedly different. The patrons around her watched, anticipation rippling through the room as the weight of Megan's actions settled in. Feeling the pressure mount, Megan's tone shifted, a hint of desperation creeping into her voice as she addressed the manager. "Look, this is really unnecessary," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "We don't need to get the police involved. I just felt, I mean, I reacted out of fear. I wasn't trying to cause any trouble." The manager, arms crossed and expression unwavering, gave her a measured look. "Fear or not," he replied, his voice steady, "you threw your coffee at another customer without provocation. That's unacceptable. We can't just let something like that slide." His words were calm, each one measured to convey the gravity of her actions. The authority in his voice silenced her protest, and she shrank back, visibly rattled. Megan shot a glance at James, her eyes flashing with a mixture of resentment and desperation. For a brief moment, she looked as if she might say something to him, an apology or maybe another thinly veiled accusation. But her resolve faltered under the unyielding gaze of the crowd who watched her with wary eyes, their quiet judgment making her shift uncomfortably. James remained silent, his face impassive as he absorbed the moment. He knew that his words weren't necessary. Her actions had spoken louder than anything he could have said. He felt a profound sense of validation, a quiet triumph in the face of her increasingly flimsy defenses. It was a moment of rare justice, one that had come not through his own intervention, but through the support of strangers who had chosen to speak up. Minutes later, the sound of sirens approaching broke the heavy silence, sending a ripple of tension through the room. Megan's face paled even further, her hands twisting nervously as she glanced toward the entrance. The inevitability of what was coming seemed to sink in, her confident facade crumbling as the reality of her actions bore down on her. Two police officers entered the cafe, their presence commanding as they scanned the room. The manager stepped forward to greet them, gesturing subtly toward Megan and James as he offered a quick, succinct summary of the incident. The officers nodded, their expressions neutral but attentive as they absorbed the details, their eyes flickering between Megan and James, noting the stains on his shirt and the tense expressions on the faces of the gathered patrons. One of the officers approached James first, his tone calm and professional. "Sir, we'd like to hear your account of what happened here," he said, a notepad in hand as he prepared to take down details. James nodded, grateful for the opportunity to finally share his side without interruption. "I was waiting in line for my coffee," James began, keeping his voice steady and clear. When it was called, I picked it up, and he nodded toward Megan, claimed I took her order. She began accusing me, getting louder, and then threw her coffee at me. He gestured toward the dark stain on his shirt, the remnants of her impulsive assault. The officer listened carefully, occasionally nodding as he jotted down notes. When James finished, the officer glanced toward the patrons nearby, his gaze shifting between the various people who had recorded the incident. "Did anyone here record what happened?" he asked, his voice carrying the expectation that someone would come forward. Several hands shot up, phones in hand, and a few patrons stepped closer, eager to share the evidence they had gathered. The second officer took charge of collecting contact information and reviewing snippets of the footage, nodding in acknowledgement as each clip confirmed James's account. Megan, watching the scene unfold, grew visibly anxious. She raised a trembling hand as if attempting to make her voice heard, but hesitated as the first officer approached her, his expression professional but firm. "Ma'am," he said, "I'd like to hear your version of events as well." Megan took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, though her voice wavered with a hint of desperation. I, I just felt unsafe," she stammered, clutching her arms around herself as though seeking comfort. He was, he looked aggressive, and I thought he was going to do something. I just reacted to protect myself." The officer gave her a measured look, a faint trace of skepticism flickering in his eyes. "According to multiple witnesses, you initiated the physical contact by throwing your coffee. Is that correct?" Megan opened her mouth to protest, but her words faltered as the weight of the evidence loomed over her. She glanced around, perhaps hoping for some sympathetic face, but the room remained impassive, her plea for understanding falling on deaf ears. "Yes," she finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But he was making me uncomfortable. I thought he was going to. I don't know. I just reacted." The officer nodded, acknowledging her words without giving them much credence. "We'll be reviewing the footage we've collected and speaking with everyone involved," he said, his tone professional but dismissive, making it clear that her story wasn't carrying much weight. "For now, I'm going to ask that you come with us to the station so we can clear this up." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room as the patrons watched, many exchanging glances of satisfaction, relieved to see justice unfolding. The officers guided Megan toward the exit, her expression one of defeat as she allowed herself to be led away, her bravado entirely deflated. As they left, the manager approached James, an apologetic look in his eyes. "I'm really sorry about all of this," he said, his voice low and sincere. "That was completely uncalled for, and I should have stepped in sooner." James offered a small, weary smile, the tension beginning to ease as the reality of the situation sank in. "Thank you for handling it the way you did," he replied, his tone warm despite the day's events. "It's not easy dealing with things like this, but I appreciate you stepping in and making sure the truth was heard." The manager nodded, visibly relieved. "We're just glad you're okay," he replied. "And if there's anything we can do to make this right, please don't hesitate to let us know." As the crowd began to disperse, the patrons who had silently witnessed the incident offered him small nods of solidarity and words of support. Some approached him, offering quiet words of encouragement. Others merely gave him an empathetic glance before returning to their own lives. One elderly man lingered a bit longer, reaching out to shake James's hand. "You handled yourself with dignity," he said, his voice steady and respectful. "Not everyone could have done that." James returned the handshake, feeling a wave of gratitude for the support, even if it had come later than he'd hoped. "Thank you," he replied, the words simple but sincere. As he finally left the cafe, the quietness of the street outside felt like a balm, the cool air washing away the remnants of the encounter. Despite the turmoil of the morning, he felt a profound sense of calm, a quiet reassurance that, even in the face of prejudice and hostility, there were moments when justice prevailed, and though he knew he would face challenges like this again, He left with his head held high, reminded of the strength that lay in resilience and the power of a truth witnessed by others. As the police car pulled up to the station, Megan sat in the back seat, her body tense and her face set in a hard expression. The bravado she'd shown in the cafe was gone, replaced by a mixture of fear and resentment. James, having walked calmly into the station on his own, watched her from a distance as the officers led her inside. Though he still felt the lingering sting of the morning's confrontation, he reminded himself to keep calm and let the truth speak for itself. Inside the station, the atmosphere was a blend of quiet bustle and official duty. Officers moved back and forth, handling paperwork and processing cases, their expressions impassive as they managed the daily flow. James was directed to a waiting area where he sat and letting his thoughts settle as he prepared to give his statement. Nearby, he could see Megan being guided into a separate room, her face pale as she glanced nervously around. Moments later, an officer approached James and gestured for him to follow. He was led into a small, well-lit room where another officer waited with a notepad and a calm demeanor. "Please, have a seat," the officer said, motioning toward the chair opposite him. "I'm Officer Daniels, and I'll be taking your statement today. I understand you had quite an ordeal back there." James nodded, sitting down and meeting Officer Daniels' steady gaze. "Yes, I did. It all escalated pretty quickly," he replied, his voice calm but resolute. Officer Daniels began jotting down notes as James recounted the events in detail, starting from the moment he entered the cafe to the final confrontation with Megan. He described the initial accusation, her escalating hostility, the coffee being thrown, and how she had tried to manipulate the situation by calling herself the victim. His words were clear, each detail meticulously presented to leave no room for ambiguity. As he spoke, Officer Daniels nodded, occasionally asking clarifying questions but allowing James to tell his story in full. When he finished, the officer leaned back in his chair, setting his pen down and regarding James thoughtfully. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. James," Officer Daniels said, his voice laced with professionalism and a hint of empathy. "We've also reviewed the footage provided by the witnesses, and everything seems consistent with what you've described. I know it must not have been easy to keep your composure under those circumstances." James offered a small, appreciative nod. "Thank you, officer. I've dealt with situations like this before, unfortunately. It's never easy, but I'm grateful that people stepped in to support me this time." The officer nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's unfortunate that things like this still happen," he replied, his tone sincere. "But know that your patience and composure made a difference today. It's clear to us who was in the wrong." After concluding his statement, James was escorted back to the waiting area, where he sat, a feeling of closure settling over him. Yet, as he looked around, he noticed that Megan was still in a separate room, giving her statement under the watchful eyes of two officers. She seemed more subdued, her confident demeanor replaced by nervous glances and quiet murmurs as she tried to explain her actions. A few moments later, one of the officers stepped out of the room and approached James. "We'd like to thank you for your cooperation, Mr. James," he said, his voice calm and professional. "You're free to go. Miss Megan, however, will remain here for further questioning. Her actions have raised enough concern that we'll be taking additional steps." James felt a sense of quiet satisfaction at the officer's words. Though he hadn't sought any form of revenge or retribution, the knowledge that Megan would be held accountable for her actions brought a sense of closure he hadn't expected. He rose to his feet, offering a polite nod to the officers before making his way out of the station. As he stepped into the sunlight outside, James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the morning finally lift from his shoulders. The ordeal had been draining, emotionally and physically, but it had ended in a way that reaffirmed his faith in fairness, in the idea that truth, even if not always immediate, could prevail. He began walking down the street, his thoughts shifting from the morning's events to the rest of his day, grateful for the small victory but ready to leave the encounter behind. Just as he was about to turn a corner, a voice called out to him from behind. "Excuse me, sir." Turning, he found one of the patrons from the cafe approaching him, a young woman who had been sitting by the window, phone in hand during the incident. She offered him a tentative smile, her face full of genuine sympathy. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice soft but earnest, "I'm sorry you had to go through all of that. It was hard to watch, but I'm glad you stood up for yourself." James returned her smile, appreciating her kindness. "Thank you," he replied, his voice warm. "It means a lot. I wasn't sure if anyone was going to speak up." The woman nodded, a look of regret crossing her face. "I know. I think a lot of us just didn't know what to say, but we all saw what was happening. I'm glad the police took it seriously." They shared a quiet moment of understanding before she nodded again, offering a small wave as she turned to leave. James watched her go, feeling a sense of solidarity that softened the bitterness of the day's events. As he continued his walk, his mind drifted back to Megan's accusations, her contempt, the venomous tone in her voice. He knew that incidents like these would continue to arise, that prejudice and assumptions were not things that could be eradicated in a day. But he also knew that with each moment of resilience, each instance where he chose to stand firm, he was strengthening his own resolve, proving to himself that he was more than the biases of others. The sun shone brightly as he moved further down the street, a reminder of the clarity and warmth that could still be found, even after the darkest moments. And as he walked, he held his head high, each step a testament to his strength, his dignity, and the quiet power of truth. As James made his way home, the morning's events replayed in his mind, the details still vivid but beginning to settle like fading echoes. He felt an odd blend of exhaustion and relief. Exhaustion from the confrontation itself, from having to defend his dignity so publicly, and relief that he had ultimately been able to do so with integrity intact. Though he knew he'd likely remember this day for a long time, it felt somehow different, less bitter and more like a hard-earned affirmation of his own resilience. Back at his apartment, he set his keys down and sank into a chair by the window, the city outside bustling with its usual rhythm, indifferent to the personal battles its people faced each day. He took a deep breath, letting the familiar sights of his neighborhood bring him a sense of comfort. The ordeal had left him with much to think about, and as he settled in, he began to process the layers of emotion stirred up by the experience. For James, encounters like the one in the cafe were far from unfamiliar. They were woven into the fabric of his life, subtle reminders of the prejudice that still lingered in society, sometimes hidden beneath the surface, sometimes glaringly obvious. He had learned long ago that to navigate the world as he did required a unique kind of strength, a quiet resilience that demanded calm and composure even in the face of hostility. Today, though, had reminded him of something even deeper, the power of speaking up, of holding his ground. He thought back to the moment when Megan had thrown the coffee at him, the scalding liquid staining his clothes, the sting more emotional than physical. In that instant, he had felt a wave of emotions he'd had to control, a surge of anger, hurt, and frustration that he'd been forced to swallow. He had held back not out of fear, but out of an understanding that his response, his restraint, would ultimately speak louder than any reaction of anger could have. It was an exhausting reality, yet he knew it was one he'd continue to face with the same determination. But the morning's events had also left him with a renewed sense of hope. He remembered the patrons in the cafe who had come forward, recording what they had seen, offering their silent support. Though they hadn't initially spoken up, they had recognized the injustice. And in the end, they had acted. The young woman who'd approached him outside the station had been particularly impactful, a reminder that, despite the hesitation, there were people willing to stand on the side of truth when it mattered most. As he continued to reflect, a sense of pride welled up in him, filling the spaces where anger and bitterness had once been. He had faced Megan's hostility and manipulation without letting her narrative consume him. He had walked out of the cafe and then the police station with his integrity intact, and that was a victory no one could take from him. He felt a new resolve settle within him, a determination to continue living in a way that upheld his values, regardless of the obstacles. Later that evening, James decided to write down his experience. He opened his laptop, fingers hovering over the keys for a moment as he considered how to begin. It wasn't that he intended to share the story widely, he simply felt a need to document it, to give words to the emotions he had felt, to the strength it had taken to stand his ground. He began typing, the words flowing naturally as he recounted each moment, each feeling, laying them bare on the screen. He wrote about the initial encounter, about Megan's accusations and how her words had cut into him like barbed wire. He described the way he had felt the room close in around him, the tension mounting as her hostility escalated. And then he wrote about the calm he had summoned, the quiet defiance that had allowed him to stand firm. He wrote about the police station, the relief he'd felt when the officers had listened, had believed him, and the validation that had come with knowing others had seen the truth. As he finished, he leaned back, reading over his words. The story wasn't just a recounting of events. It was a testament to his own resilience, a reminder of the strength he carried within himself. He felt a weight lift from his chest, the act of writing a form of catharsis that left him feeling lighter, more at peace. The next day, as he moved through his routines, James noticed a subtle shift in his perspective. He walked with his head held a little higher, his steps more grounded. He no longer felt the lingering tension from the confrontation, but instead carried a sense of quiet pride, a recognition of his own fortitude. In the days that followed, he shared his experience with a few close friends, recounting the details in the same calm, measured way he had handled the situation itself. His friends listened with empathy, their support another layer of validation that bolstered his sense of belonging and purpose. They reminded him that he wasn't alone, that there were people who understood, who stood with him, even if they hadn't been present in that cafe. As time went on, James continued to encounter challenges, but he faced them with a renewed strength. The memory of that day in the cafe a source of quiet motivation. He knew there would always be people like Megan, people who harbored biases and wielded them like weapons. But he also knew that there were others who, when it mattered most, would stand up for what was right. The memory of that day became a touchstone for him, a reminder of the power of resilience, of truth, and of the quiet but profound impact of standing one's ground. And as he moved forward, James held on to that lesson, knowing that, in the end, the dignity he carried within himself was the greatest victory he could claim. And so, life went on. The memory of that morning in the cafe remained with him, not as a scar but as a badge of honor, a testament to his strength in the face of adversity. In the quiet moments, he would occasionally revisit the memory, feeling the sting of Megan's words, but also the pride in how he had handled himself, in the resilience he had shown. It was a simple but powerful realization that he could face whatever came his way, rooted in his values, confident in his own worth. And as he continued to navigate his life, he carried that sense of pride with him, a quiet strength that no one could ever take away.